He hears faint murmurs from the living room and rounds the corner, only to find Helen and Frank tangled together, their faces frozen in shock. The sound of a wine glass shattering on the hardwood floor is the only noise as Jim's world crumbles, in slow motion. She sits beside him, her voice calm yet probing, and gently asks, "You look like someone carrying the weight of the world. Want to talk about it?" Jim grips the counter, his knuckles turning white. "You think you can ask for my help after what you've done?" he snaps. Frank's silence is deafening, and then he mutters, "This is life or death, Jim." Jim watches as Frank shakily lifts the lid of the mysterious crate. His breath catches when stacks of cash glimmer in the dim light, but it's the black, ominous device nestled at the center that makes his blood run cold. Before he can ask what it is, one of the gunmen growls, "That's the reason you're still alive." Jim, wounded but determined, takes cover behind a stack of crates. He turns to see Frank standing over him, his face pale and conflicted. "Frank," Jim pleads, "this isn't you. Don't let him control you." Welcome to the Alibis Exposed, where trust meets betrayal in the dark. Jim sat in the quiet of his living room, the weight of the day's events heavy on his chest. He stared at the empty glass of whiskey on the table in front of him, his thoughts spiraling into a dark place he hadn't visited in years. It had only been a week since he discovered the truth. His wife, Helen, had been cheating on him. And not just with anyone, she'd been involved with Frank, his best friend. His mind kept replaying that night, the moment he walked into the house and saw the two of them together, tangled in a web of lies and betrayal. Jim had always prided himself on his loyalty. He had been loyal to his friends, his family, and most of all to Helen. They had built a life together, raised a daughter, and lived through both good times and bad. But none of that seemed to matter now. The truth shattered everything. Helen had been seeing Frank for months, maybe longer. The man who Jim had trusted above all others had crossed the line in the worst way imaginable. That night, after walking in on them, Jim had confronted them. He didn't yell. He didn't throw punches or demand explanations. He just stood there, speechless, feeling like the ground beneath him had vanished. Frank had tried to explain, but his words felt hollow, as if he were talking through a mask of guilt. Helen had said nothing at first, her face a mask of regret and shame. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. Jim had left the house that night, wandering the streets for hours. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay there. He needed to escape, to clear his head, to figure out what to do next. In the days that followed, he had gone through the motions, work, dinner, sleep, but everything felt meaningless. He couldn't look at Helen without seeing the betrayal in her eyes, and he couldn't look at Frank without feeling disgusted. That's when Susan came into his life. Susan was a neighbor, someone Jim had seen around but never really talked to before. She was kind, always friendly, and had a way of making people feel at ease. Jim didn't expect anything from her, but when they crossed paths one afternoon by the pool, something shifted. She asked how he was doing, and for the first time in days, Jim opened up. He told her everything, about Helen, about Frank, about the pain he was feeling. Susan listened without judgment, her warm eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she didn't offer empty words of sympathy or advice. She simply said, "I'm sorry you're going through this, but I think you deserve more than this life of hurt." At first, Jim didn't know how to react. He wasn't looking for comfort or someone to take Helen's place. But Susan had a way of making him feel seen, something Helen hadn't done in a long time. Over the next few days, Jim and Susan began to talk more. Their conversations were light at first, but over time they grew deeper, more personal. She never pushed him, but he found himself confiding in her more and more, sharing parts of himself that he hadn't even shared with Helen in years. Then on Christmas Eve, Jim made the decision that would change everything. He had been sitting at home alone, nursing a drink, when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Susan. "If you're up for some company, I'll be at my place in an hour. We can talk, maybe relax a little." It was a simple message, but Jim's heart raced. He hadn't been with anyone since Helen had betrayed him, and the idea of being with someone else felt strange. But there was something about Susan. He wanted to see her, to feel something other than the cold emptiness he had been carrying. He replied quickly, "I'll be there." When Jim arrived at Susan's apartment, she greeted him with a soft smile and a glass of wine. "I'm glad you came," she said, leading him to a cozy couch. The apartment was warm, inviting, nothing like the cold silence of his own home. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Slowly, Jim began to relax. He felt comfortable, safe. The anger and hurt he had been carrying for so long seemed to fade away, replaced by a calmness he hadn't experienced in months. As the night wore on, Susan stood and moved closer to him. "I know you've been through a lot, Jim," she said, her voice low and soothing. "But I think you deserve to feel good again. Maybe I can help with that." Jim's pulse quickened. He didn't know what she meant at first, but as she moved closer, he understood. It wasn't just about comforting him anymore. Susan was offering something more. Something Jim had been missing for a long time. The idea of being with her, of feeling wanted again, stirred something deep inside him. He had spent so long being the loyal husband, the one who always put others first, that he had forgotten what it felt like to prioritize himself. "I've been alone for so long," he said, his voice a whisper. "I don't even know if I'll be good at this anymore." Susan smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "You don't have to be perfect, Jim. Just let yourself feel. You deserve it." In that moment, Jim made a choice. He leaned in, kissing her gently, and for the first time in months, he felt alive. The night passed in a blur of sensations, each one reminding him of what he had been missing. For a while, he was able to forget about everything: the betrayal, the hurt, the shattered trust. He was just Jim again, a man who had the chance to feel something real. The next morning, as the sun rose on Christmas Day, Jim felt different. The weight that had been crushing him for weeks had lightened, even if just a little. He knew that what he had done wasn't right, that it was a temporary escape from his pain. But in that moment, he needed it. He needed to feel like himself again. But the consequences of his actions would soon catch up with him in ways he couldn't even imagine. Susan left early, promising to meet him later. Jim returned home to an empty house. The silence felt deafening. As he sat down at his kitchen table, his phone rang. It was Emily, his daughter. She hadn't called in weeks. Jim answered, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. "Dad."
"Where are you? You didn't come home for Christmas," Emily said, her voice filled with concern.
"I don't blame you for not wanting to be around Mom, but I wish you had told me where you were." Jim swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "I'm fine, Em. I just needed some space." But Emily wasn't done. "I've been thinking
a lot about everything that's happened. I know I haven't been perfect either. But Dad, I need you to know that I'm sorry for not standing by you. I realize now how much you've been hurt. Jim felt a lump form in his throat. I don't blame you, Emily. I don't know what to do anymore. Emily paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. Mom's not happy, Dad. She's been so focused on Frank and now she's lost everything. I don't
want to lose you too. Jim knew she was right. He had lost so much already, his trust, his family, his peace of mind. And now he had to decide how to move forward. Would he try to rebuild what he had with Helen, or would he continue down a path that led him further away from the life he once knew? As he sat there, the weight of his choices pressing on him, Jim realized one thing. Loyalty had been his guiding principle, but it had also been his trap. And now the only way out was to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Jim stood by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was streaked with shades of purple and orange, a beauty that felt distant, almost out of reach. His mind was a storm of thoughts, and his heart was a heavy weight he couldn't escape. He had always believed that loyalty was the foundation
of any relationship, the bond that held people together through thick and thin. But what did loyalty mean when the very people you trusted the most betrayed you? Helen had reached out to him several times since their confrontation, but Jim couldn't
bring himself to answer. He had seen her tears, heard her apologies, but they felt empty now. How could he ever look at her the same way again after what she had done? And Frank, the man he had called his best friend for over a decade, the one person he thought he could rely on above all others. Frank had been more than a friend, he was like a brother. But now Jim couldn't shake the feeling that he had been nothing more than a pawn in Frank's game. The phone buzzed on the table, snapping Jim from his thoughts. It was a message from Susan. "Hey, hope you're okay. Want to meet up tonight?" Jim stared at the screen for a moment, unsure of what to do. After everything that had happened, he was torn. Part of him wanted to see Susan again. She had become a refuge, someone who made him feel like himself again. But another part of him felt guilty. His mind kept drifting back to Helen, to the family he had promised to protect. Was he betraying his own values by seeking comfort in someone else? He sat down at the table, taking a deep breath. The decision he had to make wasn't just about Susan. It was about who he was now, who he had become. Was he the man who stood by his principles even when those principles hurt him? Or was he someone else now, someone willing to let go of his past for the sake of his own survival? Jim had been loyal for so long, and where had it gotten him? Betrayed by the one person he loved most, and now by the person he had trusted with his life. Loyalty had been a weapon used against him, a tool for manipulation. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go of that weapon. He picked up his phone and typed a quick reply to Susan. "Sure, I'll be there in an hour." As he drove to Susan's apartment, the streets seemed to blur. The night felt colder than usual, the silence deafening. He wasn't sure what he was looking for: escape, comfort, revenge. The last week had felt like a whirlwind, and Jim wasn't sure if he was running from something or towards something. All he knew was that he couldn't keep living in the past. He had to make a choice about who he was going to be moving forward. When Jim arrived, Susan greeted him with a warm smile, but there was something different in her eyes. It wasn't just kindness anymore, it was something deeper, something that made Jim feel both at ease and on edge. "You okay?" she asked, as they sat down on the couch. Jim nodded, though the truth was far more complicated. I don't know what to feel anymore, Susan. I keep thinking about Helen and Frank and it's all just a blur. I'm angry, I'm hurt, but I'm
also confused. I thought I knew who I was. Susan leaned in, her voice soft. You're not the only one feeling that way. I've been thinking about everything too, Jim. About loyalty, about trust. Sometimes it feels like those things just
don't mean anything anymore. Jim looked at her, surprised by the honesty in her words. You're right. I spent my whole life believing loyalty was everything, but now it feels like it's just a trap. I let myself get stuck in it, and now it's all falling apart. Susan didn't say anything for a moment, just let the silence
linger. Then she spoke again, her tone measured. Loyalty can be a dangerous thing, Jim. It can make you do things you never thought possible.
Sometimes it makes you blind to what's right in front of you. I think you've been loyal to the wrong people. Jim's heart skipped a beat. Was she talking about herself? Was she telling him that he didn't owe loyalty to Helen or Frank anymore? The thought lingered in his mind, but he didn't want to voice it. What he needed was clarity, not more confusion. I don't know what to do, Susan, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper.
I feel like I've lost everything, and now I'm not even sure what I'm supposed to be loyal to anymore. Susan placed a hand on his. You're loyal to yourself, Jim. That's what matters now. The words hung in the air, and Jim
felt something stir within him. He had spent so long putting others before himself, believing that loyalty meant sacrificing his own needs. But Susan's words made him realize that he had been neglecting his own worth for too long. He had to put himself first for once, to stop being a puppet to the expectations of others. As the evening wore on, Jim and Susan continued talking. The conversation shifted from one topic to the next, but the tension between them grew with each passing moment. Jim couldn't ignore the way he felt when he was with her. There was a connection, something he hadn't felt in a long time. But there was also a nagging voice in the back of his mind, reminding him of his responsibilities, of his family. When the night finally came to a close, Susan walked Jim to the door.
Take care of yourself, Jim, she said, her voice soft but firm. You deserve better than what you've been given. Jim nodded, unable to find the words to express everything he was feeling. As he stepped out into the cold night air,
he couldn't shake the feeling that Susan was right. He had been loyal to others to the point where he had lost himself. But where did that leave him now? What was he supposed to do with all the pain, the betrayal, and the guilt that had accumulated
over the last few weeks?
The next morning, Jim woke up to an unexpected message. It was from Frank. His heart skipped as he read the message. We need to talk. I made some mistakes, Jim. I need your help. The words hit Jim like a punch to the gut. Help? After everything that had happened, Frank still thought he could ask for help? The audacity, the nerve. But there was something in Frank's words that Jim couldn't ignore. Was Frank truly remorseful? Or was he just trying to manipulate Jim again, using his loyalty to his advantage? Jim felt a surge of anger. He had trusted Frank. He had stood by him through everything. And now Frank was asking for help? Jim could hardly believe it. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was the moment he had been waiting for. This was his chance to take control of the situation, to stop being the victim of others' betrayal. He picked up the phone and dialed Frank's number. His hand shook slightly as it rang, but Jim was resolute. He wasn't going to let Frank dictate the terms anymore. When Frank answered, Jim wasted no time. What do you want, Frank? Frank's voice sounded strained. Jim, I know I've messed up. I'm sorry, man, but there's something I need to tell you, something big. I need your help to fix it. Jim paused, his heart pounding in his chest. What could be so important that you think I'll help you? Frank hesitated, and Jim knew right then that this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. This was the beginning of something darker, something that would force Jim to make a choice, stay loyal to the man who had betrayed him, or take control of his own destiny, even if it meant turning his back on everything he had once believed. Jim sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the phone in his hand. Frank's message still burned in his mind. He had always considered Frank to be a man of integrity, someone who valued loyalty above all else. But now, after everything that had happened, Jim was beginning to question whether any of that had been real. Frank had used him, manipulated him, and now, after all the betrayal, he was asking for help. A cold sense of dread washed over Jim. He knew that helping Frank would only pull him deeper into the mess that had already consumed his life, but the thought of turning his back on the man he had once considered a brother filled him with guilt. Could he really just walk away? Could he ignore the years of friendship and loyalty they had shared? The phone buzzed again, pulling Jim from his thoughts. It was Frank calling. His heart raced, and for a moment he considered letting it go to voicemail, but something inside him urged him to answer. Jim! Frank's voice sounded desperate, more so than Jim had ever heard it before. I'm in trouble, man. Big trouble, and I can't get out of it without your help. Jim gripped the phone, tighter, trying to steady his breathing. The last thing he wanted to do was get pulled back into Frank's chaos, but the urgency in Frank's voice was hard to ignore. What kind of trouble? Jim asked, his voice low. Frank's silence stretched, for a moment, like he was debating whether or not to tell Jim the truth. Finally, he spoke. I messed up, Jim. I made some bad deals, got involved with people I shouldn't have. Now they're coming after me, and they won't stop until they get what they want. Jim felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had heard rumors about Frank's business dealings in the past, but he never imagined things had gotten this far. Frank had always been careful, cunning even, but now it seemed like his friend had pushed himself into a corner from which there was no
escape. And what do you expect me to do about it?
Jim's voice was laced with disbelief. I'm not some superhero, Frank. You got yourself into this mess. You get yourself out. I didn't want it to go this far, Frank pleaded. I've been trying to fix it, but I can't do it.
Alone. You're the only one I trust, Jim. The only one who knows how to handle things like this. I need you to help me make it right. Jim's mind raced. He thought about the promises he had made to Helen, the vows he had sworn to his family. His loyalty was no longer a simple matter of trust. It was a matter of survival. Every action he took from here on out would have consequences, and he wasn't sure if he could live with them. I'm not sure I can help you, Frank, Jim said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. I've been loyal to you, man, but this isn't loyalty anymore. It's a trap. Frank sighed heavily on the other end of the line. I know, Jim. I know I've screwed up, but I'm asking you as a friend to help me one last time. I can make it up to you. You have my word. Jim clenched his fists. He had heard that phrase before, you have my word. It had always meant something, a promise that Frank would never break. But now, after everything, those words felt hollow. Jim wasn't sure what he was holding on to anymore. Was it friendship, loyalty, or the remnants of a past that was slipping through his fingers? You don't get it, Frank, Jim said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know who you are anymore,
The man I thought you were would never put me in this position. I've been protecting you all this time, but at what cost? You've used me, Frank. I've sacrificed everything for you, and now you're asking me to risk it all again." There was a long pause before Frank spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. "I never meant for any of this to happen, Jim. I thought I was doing the right thing. But I see now that I've dragged you down with me. I've put you in a position where you have to choose between loyalty and survival, and I'm not sure which one is worth more anymore." Jim's heart ached as Frank's words hit him harder than he expected. The weight of the betrayal was like a physical presence pressing down on his chest. He had been loyal to Frank for so long, but now it seemed like that loyalty had been
his biggest mistake. Frank had used Jim's trust to manipulate him, to drag him into a world of lies, deceit, and danger. "I need time to think," Jim said, his voice hoarse. "I can't just make a decision like this on the spot. I'll
call you tomorrow." Without waiting for a response, Jim ended the call and sat in the darkness of his room, his mind spinning. He had no idea what to do. He could walk away, cut all ties with Frank, and move on with his life. Or he could help Frank dive deeper into the mess he had created and risk everything, his safety, his family, his future. But as Jim sat there, the weight of his decision pressing on him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about Frank anymore. It was about him. It was about his own survival, his own freedom from the chains of loyalty that had held him captive for so long. The next day, Jim met with Susan again, desperate for clarity. She listened patiently as he recounted the conversation with Frank, her expression thoughtful as he spoke. "Maybe this is the moment you've been waiting for," Susan said after a long pause. "Maybe Frank's betrayal is a sign that you need to break free, to stop being loyal to people who don't deserve it." Jim shook his head. "It's not that simple. I've spent years being loyal to Frank. He's been like a brother. To me, I can't just turn my back on him." "But he's not the same person you once knew," Susan replied gently. "And you're not the same person either. You've changed, Jim. You've seen the truth. Now it's time to decide who you want to be from here on out." Jim's mind whirled as Susan's words sank in. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had been holding on to a version of Frank that no longer existed. But was he ready to let go of that past? Was he ready to sever the ties that had defined so much of his life? As he left Susan's apartment, Jim felt a cold clarity settling over him. This was the moment that would define the rest of his life. No matter which path he chose, he knew it would be the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. But what kind of man would he become when the dust settled? Jim sat at the kitchen table, the cool morning light filtering through the blinds. His coffee sat untouched in front of him. He had hardly slept, his mind relentlessly spinning with the weight of the decisions he had to make. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Frank's face, the desperation in his eyes, the way he had begged for Jim's help. But the more Jim thought about it, the more it became clear that helping Frank wasn't just about loyalty, it was about self-preservation. If he didn't act soon, he would be pulled so far into Frank's web of lies and danger that there would be no escaping it. He wasn't just helping Frank anymore, he was digging himself deeper into a hole he might never crawl out of. The phone rang, pulling Jim from his thoughts. It was Frank again. Jim hesitated before answering, feeling his stomach twist. He had promised Frank he would call, but every instinct inside him screamed that this conversation could push him further than he was willing to go. "Jim, thank God you picked up," Frank's voice came through, shaky with nerves. I need you to meet me. It's urgent. Jim leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. What's going on, Frank? There was a long pause before Frank spoke again. I'm being watched. I don't know how they found out, but I can't get out of this without you. If I don't get your help, they'll come after my family. The words hit Jim like a punch to the gut. He had always known Frank to be a man of action, but hearing him so vulnerable, so terrified for his family, made Jim question everything. Was this the truth? Or was Frank manipulating him again, using his fear to pull Jim back in? Jim's mind raced, torn between the part of him that wanted to help and the part of him that knew the cost was too high. What do you need me to do? I'll explain everything when you get here, Frank said, his voice now more urgent. Please, Jim, I don't have much time. Against his better judgment, Jim agreed. He put the phone down and stood up, already feeling the familiar weight of dread settling in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, that once he made this choice, there would be no turning back. When Jim arrived at Frank's office, the tension in the air was palpable. The building was quiet, empty, as if the entire world had been put on pause. He found Frank sitting in his usual chair behind the desk, but there was something different about him now. His usually confident demeanor was gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling as he poured himself a drink. Jim took a seat across from him, watching him carefully. He could tell something was off, but he wasn't sure what. Frank had always been the type to hide his emotions, to keep everything locked up behind a mask. But now the mask was slipping. I don't know what's happening, Jim, Frank said, his voice strained. They've been following me for weeks now. I don't know how they found out about the deals, but they did, and now they want me to pay. They're not giving me any choice. If I don't do what they say, they'll kill my wife. They'll kill my kids. Jim clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a matter of business anymore. Frank's family was in danger, and that changed everything. Jim's protective instincts kicked in. He couldn't stand the thought of Frank's family being hurt. They were innocent in all of this, and Jim couldn't let them pay the price for Frank's mistakes. Who are they? Jim asked, his voice low. Frank hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if he were afraid of being overheard. Finally, he leaned in closer and whispered, I don't know. They're connected to some powerful people who don't care about anything but their own interests. All I know is that they've got connections everywhere. The police, the politicians, even some of the people in my company. I don't trust anyone, Jim, not anymore. Jim felt his blood run cold. The web Frank had spun was far deeper than he
could have imagined. And now Jim was right in the middle of it. Why didn't you tell me all of this sooner? Jim asked, his voice shaking with frustration. Why keep me in the dark?
You've been using me this whole time, Frank. You've put me in a position where I have no choice but to help you. Do you even realize what you've done? Frank's face twisted with guilt. I didn't want to drag you into this, Jim. I didn't want to involve you in my problems. But now, I don't have a choice. You're the only one who knows how to handle this kind of thing. You've got connections. You've got the skills. You're the only one I can trust. Jim's chest tightened. He could feel the anger building inside him, but he swallowed it down. He couldn't afford to lose his cool now. His focus had to be on the task at hand. Frank was desperate, and Jim knew that in this moment he could either help him or let him spiral further into the chaos that would consume them both. Fine, Jim said, his voice tight. What do you need me to do? Frank's eyes brightened, a hint of relief flashing across his face. There's a shipment coming in tonight. It's their only leverage on me right now. If we can get control of it, we'll have the upper hand. But we have to act fast, Jim. If we don't, everything will fall apart. I'll lose my family, and you'll lose everything you've worked for." Jim stared at Frank for a long moment. He could see the fear in his eyes, but he also saw something else: desperation. Frank had no other options, and now neither did Jim. "I'll help you," Jim said, the words leaving his mouth before he could think them through. "But after this, Frank, I'm done. I'm walking away from all of this, understand?" Frank nodded, his face a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "I understand, Jim. I promise you, after this, I'll get out. I'll fix everything. I'll
make it right." Jim didn't believe him. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was stopping the immediate danger to Frank's family. As Jim stood up to leave, a heavy feeling settled over him.
He had crossed the point of no return. Helping Frank might save his family, but it would only drag Jim further into the darkness. And once that line was crossed, he couldn't go back. The night was thick with tension as Jim made his way to the designated location. The city around him was still, the streets eerily quiet. His thoughts were a whirl of confusion and guilt, but there was no turning back now. The plan was in motion, and he had made his choice. There was only one way to see this through: finish what he'd started. Frank had insisted on a simple plan: take control of the shipment and escape without leaving a trace. But Jim knew better. There was no such thing as a simple plan in a world like this. Everything was complicated, especially when you were dealing with dangerous people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Frank had been naive to think it would be that easy. Jim pulled his car into an alley near the warehouse. The low hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the silence. He checked his watch, almost midnight. Frank had assured him everything would be ready, but Jim couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was no such thing as ready when you were playing with fire. He stepped out of the car, his boots tapping against the pavement, and made his way to the back entrance of the warehouse. The night air was cold, biting through his jacket as he approached the door. His heart was racing, but his movements were deliberate, controlled. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. He had everything to lose. As he reached the door, he saw Frank's figure in the shadows. The businessman's face was tense, eyes darting around nervously. For all the bravado he'd shown earlier, now he looked like a man on the edge, about to fall off a cliff. "You sure this is the right place?" Jim asked, his voice low. Frank nodded, though there was no confidence in his movement. "They'll be here any minute. We just need to grab the package and get out before anyone notices." Jim didn't answer. His instincts were screaming that this was too easy, but he didn't have the luxury of second-guessing. The shipment was supposed to be the key to everything, the leverage they needed to take control. But Jim couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger wasn't the people after Frank, it was Frank himself. The sound of engines rumbled in the distance, growing louder by the second. Jim and Frank both froze, eyes scanning the street, the warehouse. The dark shadows grew longer as headlights cut through the gloom, approaching fast. Frank's face paled. "They're here," Frank whispered urgently. "Get ready." Jim felt his pulse quicken. There was no turning back now. A convoy of black SUVs pulled into the warehouse lot, their tires screeching as they came to a halt. Men in dark clothing and masks jumped out of the vehicles, their movements swift and coordinated. Frank didn't flinch, but Jim could see the tension in his shoulders. He didn't know who these people were, but he could tell they were professionals, and Jim had never been good at dealing with professionals. The men began unloading crates from the back of one of the SUVs. Frank's eyes narrowed as he watched them, and Jim could see the gears turning in his head. He had a plan, but it was too late to turn back now. The moment the men finished unloading, Jim and Frank made their move. Frank led the way, walking confidently toward the crates, and Jim followed, keeping a few paces behind. The sound of footsteps echoed in the empty warehouse, growing louder as they approached the loading dock. Then, everything exploded into chaos. A loud bang rang out, followed by a string of gunshots. Frank froze, his eyes wide with shock. The men had drawn weapons and they were firing at them. Jim's instincts kicked in, and he ducked behind a stack of crates, heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know who had started the shooting, but he didn't care. All that mattered now was survival. Frank grabbed Jim's arm, pulling him into a nearby room. "What the hell is going on?" Frank yelled, his voice cracking with fear. Jim didn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to process the situation. He could feel his pulse in his throat, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was no longer about saving Frank's family. It was about staying alive. The door slammed shut behind them and Jim quickly locked it. He pressed his ear to the door, listening for movement. The sound of footsteps echoed outside, but they
seemed to be moving away. "We need to get out of here," Jim said, his voice low and urgent.
"This is getting out of hand," Frank nodded, but his face was pale. He was clearly shaken, and Jim knew that whatever trust he had left in Frank was rapidly deteriorating. Frank had been the one to drag him into this mess, but now Jim was starting to question whether he had made the right decision. Frank had been hiding something from him, something more than just the shipment. He had been keeping secrets, and Jim didn't know if he could trust him anymore. "Where's the shipment?" Jim asked, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. Frank hesitated. "It's in the back. There's a hidden room. It's the only way out." Jim's eyes narrowed. "A hidden room? Why didn't you tell me about this before?" "I didn't think we'd need it," Frank replied, his voice trembling. "But we don't have a choice now. If we don't get
to it before they do, we're dead." Jim took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He didn't know who was after them, but he knew one thing for sure. This was no longer a simple heist. This was a setup. Frank had lied to him, and now
they were both trapped in a game they didn't fully understand. He turned to Frank, his face hardening. "Lead the way, and don't try anything funny." Frank nodded, his face pale and filled with fear. He led Jim through the dark corridors of the warehouse, moving quickly, almost as if he were running from something. Every door they passed seemed to lead nowhere, and Jim couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded toward something. The deeper they went, the more Jim's gut twisted. Finally, they reached a metal door at the back of the building. Frank fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he tried to unlock it. Jim stood behind him, his eyes scanning the area, but there was no sign of the armed men. It was quiet, too. Quiet. When Frank finally opened the door, the room inside was stark and cold. It was filled with crates, but one crate in particular stood out. It was much larger than the others, and it had been sealed with thick metal bands. "This is it," Frank said, his voice low. "The shipment." Jim stepped forward, his hand hovering over the crate. His fingers brushed the cold metal, and his heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. Whatever was inside would change everything. Before he could open it, a voice rang out from behind them. "Going somewhere?" Jim spun around, his heart racing as he saw two men standing in the doorway, guns drawn. They were wearing dark suits, their faces cold and impassive. Frank's face drained of color. How did you—" The man who had spoken stepped forward, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "We've been following you for a while, Frank. You didn't think you'd be able to just take the shipment and disappear, did you?" Jim's mind was spinning. Frank had been double-crossed. The real danger wasn't just the people after him, it was the people Frank had trusted, and now Jim was in the middle of it all. The two men in suits moved toward Jim and Frank, there, guns trained on them with deadly precision. The chill in the air deepened, and Jim's mind raced. Frank was visibly sweating, his face drained of color, his hands trembling as if the weight of his decisions was finally sinking in. "Frank," Jim whispered, his voice low and steady. "Who are these guys?" Frank swallowed hard, his lips parting as if to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. The man who had spoken earlier stepped closer, his smile widening with a cold, calculating gleam in his eyes. "They're with the people you've been trying to double-cross, Frank," the man said, his voice smooth like silk, but laced with
menace. "And you've just sealed your fate. Both of you have." Jim's heart skipped a beat. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Frank wasn't just in debt. He was involved in something far deeper, something much darker.
Jim had been a pawn in Frank's game all along, and now he was caught in the crossfire of a war he hadn't even known existed. Frank tried to stammer out an explanation, but the man raised a hand, silencing him. "You've been playing with fire, Frank," the man continued, his voice cold.
"And now your friend here," he gestured to Jim with a slight tilt of his head, "is caught in the flames." Jim felt a surge of anger, but he kept his emotions in check. Panic wasn't going to get him out of this. Frank had dragged him into this mess, and now it was time to get answers. "Why?" Jim asked, his voice sharper now, directed at Frank. "Why didn't you tell me, Frank?"
"What's really going on here?" Frank's eyes darted between Jim and the two men with guns. His lips trembled, and for the first time, Jim saw fear in his eyes. The confident businessman, the man who had always prided himself on his control, was now nothing more than a scared shell of his former self.
I didn't have a choice," Frank muttered, his voice breaking. "They've got my family. They threatened to hurt them if I didn't cooperate. I thought if I could pull this off, I could get them out. I didn't think it would go this far."
"Jim, I never meant for any of this to happen." Jim took a step forward, his fists clenched. "So you used me," he growled, the betrayal cutting deeper than he expected. "You put me in the middle of your mess, dragged me into this, and for what? So you could save your skin?" Frank's eyes were pleading now, but Jim couldn't find it in himself to feel sympathy. This wasn't the man he had trusted, the man who had called him a friend. This was a desperate man, someone who had been willing to sacrifice anyone to save himself. "Please, Jim," Frank said, his voice trembling. "I didn't want this. I thought we could get away clean. I thought—" "The shipment was the key, but I was wrong. You don't understand these people. They don't leave anything to chance. They'll come after you next if you don't play along." Jim's mind was spinning. His loyalty to Frank had been a part of him for so long, but now it felt like a joke. This was no longer about friendship or trust. This was about survival. The man in the suit chuckled darkly, watching Jim and Frank's exchange. "You think we're the ones who will come after you?" he said, amusement flickering in his eyes. "No, Frank. You're the one who's been running. We've been patient, but patience has its limits. And now you're out of time." Frank's eyes darted toward the door, as if looking for a way out, but the men were already closing in. Jim's instincts screamed at him to run, but he knew there was no escape from this. The walls were closing in on both of them, and the truth had finally come to light. "You're both coming with us," the man said, his voice final. "No more games. The shipment is ours now, and you're going to help us deliver it." Jim felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He had no idea what was in that crate, but whatever it was worth more than their lives. And in that moment, Jim realized just how far Frank had gone to get what he wanted. The stakes were much higher than he'd imagined. This wasn't about saving a family. It was about power, control, and a web of lies too complex to untangle. The man in the suit gestured for the two other armed men to move forward. Jim instinctively stepped back, putting distance between himself and the gunman, but there was nowhere to go. The room was small and the walls felt like they were closing in. "You're making a mistake," Jim said, his voice tight with anger. "If you think I'm going to help you, you're wrong." The man gave him a cold, indifferent look. "It's not about what you want. It's about what's going to happen next." "Now move." The men approached, their guns still aimed at Jim and Frank. Jim's mind raced, looking for any possible way out. But Frank was already moving, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had already given in, already accepted his fate. The once confident businessman had become a broken man, and Jim could see it in his eyes. The desperation was overwhelming. Jim's hand hovered over the gun hidden in his jacket, but he hesitated. He could fight back, but at what cost? Frank was too deep in this mess. The moment Jim made a move, everything would spiral out of control. His only option now was to play along, at least until he could find a way to turn the tables. The man with the gun raised an eyebrow, watching Jim closely.
"I don't think you want to test me, Jim. You're not in control here. But if you want to make it out alive, you'll do as we say." Jim's thoughts were a blur, but one thing was clear. Frank had gotten them into this mess, and now it
was up to Jim to get them out. He had to make a choice, survive and play along, or risk it all for a chance at revenge. Either way, he knew it wouldn't be easy. "Fine," Jim said, his voice cold and resigned. "But know this, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me." As they were escorted out of the room, Jim could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was no longer about loyalty, it was about survival, and Frank had better hope that Jim didn't decide to make him pay for the lies, the manipulation, and the betrayal. The cold, damp air bit at Jim's skin as he and Frank were ushered down a narrow hallway into a dimly lit room. The flickering, overhead lights cast long shadows on the walls, making the place feel even more oppressive. Jim's mind was racing. The events had spiraled so quickly, and now everything felt like a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. He glanced over at Frank, who was visibly shaking. His eyes were red-rimmed, his lips twitching nervously. It was clear now that Frank had never truly been in control of the situation. The facade of confidence had crumbled, leaving behind a man desperate to survive. The two gunmen led them to a small table in the center of the room. On it sat a wooden crate, its edges chipped and worn, as though it had been through a lot. Jim's stomach churned. He didn't know what was inside, but he could feel the weight of it, the significance of it, pressing down on him. Frank's
fate and his own was tied to whatever was in that crate. "Open it!" one of the gunmen barked, his tone sharp. Frank's hands trembled as he reached for the lid, his movements slow, deliberate.
Jim stood back, his eyes darting around the room, calculating. His mind was still working out how to turn the tables, how to escape. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Frank was no longer the man he had once known. Frank had been pulled into a web of lies and danger, and now he had dragged Jim down with him. As Frank lifted the lid of the crate, Jim's heart raced. He had been bracing for something dangerous, something illicit, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw inside. The crate was filled with stacks of cash, bundles of crisp, tightly packed bills. But there was something else in there, something more sinister. A small black box, its contents obscured by a cloth. The moment Jim laid eyes on it, he knew this wasn't just about money. This was something more dangerous, something that could change everything. The gunman stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the contents of the crate. He turned to the other man, nodding once. "It's all here," he said, his voice low. "The shipment is complete. Frank, you've done well." Frank let out a shaky breath, relief flooding his face. But Jim didn't share that relief. He felt a deep unease settling in his chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He didn't know what was in the black box, but he had a sinking feeling that it was about to get much worse. "You think you're free now, Frank?" the first gunman asked, his voice colder than ever. "You think just because you delivered the shipment your troubles are over? Think again." Frank swallowed hard, his eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean? I've done what you asked. The shipment's here. I can go, right?" The gunman chuckled darkly. "Oh no, you're not going anywhere just yet. We've been watching you, Frank. You thought you could run, thought you could hide. But you're too valuable now." Jim's blood ran cold. What was happening? Frank had delivered the shipment, and yet it was clear the gunmen were not planning to let him off the hook. There was something else at play here, something deeper. "What do you want from me?" Frank pleaded, his voice breaking. "I've done everything you've asked. I've got my family back. I'll keep quiet, I swear. Just let me go." But the gunman wasn't listening. He reached for the black box, his fingers quick and precise as he opened it, revealing a small, gleaming device inside. Jim couldn't quite make out what it was, but it looked like something out of a nightmare, a piece of tech, possibly a detonator, or worse. "This," the gunman said, holding the device up for both men to see, "is your insurance, Frank. You're not just a pawn in our game anymore. You're a player." Jim's mind raced. Insurance? What was this device, and why did it make Frank look like he had seen a ghost? It was becoming clear that Frank had underestimated how deep he was in this mess. The stakes were higher than Jim had thought, and he was now wrapped up in something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. "Frank," Jim said, his voice calm despite the chaos in his mind. "What's going on? What is this device?" Frank turned to him, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "I didn't know," he said, his voice cracking. I thought I was just moving money, but this is bigger. It's not just about the cash, it's about control."
"These people," he stopped, swallowing hard. "They've been using me all along. They've been watching everything. And now—" His voice trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging in the air like a death sentence. The gunman sneered, holding the device up in front of them. "You're both going to help us deliver this, whether you like it or not." "This is the final piece of the puzzle, and once it's done, Frank, you'll finally be free. Free from your family, free from your debts. But Jim," he turned his cold gaze to Jim, "you're going to be part of this, whether you want to or not." Jim's mind raced as he realized what was happening. This was no longer about a simple delivery. This was about a conspiracy, a game of manipulation that extended far beyond Frank and his family. Jim was caught in the middle with no clear way out, and then, as if to confirm his worst fears, the gunman turned to his partner and spoke in a low voice, just loud enough for Jim and Frank to hear. "We've already made arrangements. The boss doesn't like loose ends." Jim felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Loose ends. What did that mean? Frank was in over his head.
and so was he. The gunmen were playing a far more dangerous game than either of them had realized. "You're both going to do exactly what we say," the gunman continued. "No one gets to walk away from this, not until the job is done." Frank's voice was a whisper filled with panic. "Please, no, I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to get my family out." The gunman's laugh was humorless. "You don't get to ask for anything anymore. You're already in too deep." Jim knew, then, that there was no way out for them, not unless they played along, not unless they outsmarted the people who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. The black box, the money, the lives at stake, it was all part of a larger plan, one that Jim was now trapped in. His loyalty to Frank had brought him here, but it was his instincts that would have to get them out. He didn't know how, but he couldn't give up. Not yet. The weight of the black box pressed heavily on Jim's mind, much like the crushing silence that had descended upon the room. He could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, but everything else felt suspended in time. Frank stood beside him, his body rigid, eyes glazed with fear and confusion. The gunmen moved with clinical precision, the ominous device still in their hands. Jim's pulse raced, his thoughts were scattered, but one thing was crystal clear: they were both in too deep. Frank had been a fool, dragged into a world he never understood, but Jim was no better. Loyalty had led him here, and now he was shackled to a nightmare of betrayal and manipulation. The question wasn't how they could escape, it was whether they could outsmart those who had set this trap in motion. The gunman holding the black box turned to his partner, whispering something Jim couldn't quite hear. He leaned in closer, his eyes never leaving the crate, as though something far more sinister than money or weapons was hidden within its depths. Jim's instinct screamed that they were walking a fine line, one step from falling off the edge into a world where escape wasn't even an option. "You both look like you've seen ghosts," the gunman said, his voice a mockery of amusement. "Don't worry. You're just going to do your part, and then we'll let you walk. Easy, right?" But Jim knew better. The more he looked at the gunmen, their cold, emotionless faces, the more he realized that there was no walking away from this. There was no easy. There was no letting go. These men were playing a game of high stakes, and they had every intention of ensuring that Jim and Frank were mere pawns in their larger scheme. "What's the plan?" Frank asked, his voice trembling. "Just tell us what you want us to do. We'll do it, I swear." The gunman smirked, his eyes glinting with something dark and dangerous. "It's not that simple, Frank. We need to know if you're loyal.
If you're both willing to go all the way, this isn't a game you can walk away from. Not anymore." Jim's stomach churned. Loyalty. He had thought Frank's loyalty was the key to their survival, but now he understood the ugly truth. Loyalty in a world like this wasn't something that kept you safe. It was something that made you a target. His loyalty to Frank had already cost him, and now his loyalty was about to lead them into even darker waters. "So what's the next step?" Jim asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his mind. The gunman's smirk widened. He walked toward the table, his fingers brushing the crate as though it were a prize. "You'll deliver the device, but not just anywhere.
You'll take it to the old warehouse by the docks. There's someone waiting for you there. They'll know what to do with it." Frank let out a shaky breath. "And if we refuse?" The gunman didn't hesitate. "Refusal isn't an option. You'll do as we say, or we'll make sure your families suffer. Every last one of them." Jim felt the blood drain from his face. The threat was clear, and he knew it wasn't an empty one. These men didn't play games. They carried out their threats with cold precision. The thought of what could happen to his family, to Frank's family, was enough to make his blood run cold. "Fine," Jim said through clenched teeth. "We'll do it." "Good," the gunman replied. "But remember, this is your last chance. If you screw this up, there will be no coming back." Frank's face was a mixture of fear and resignation. He had already lost his sense of control, and now it seemed he had lost the will to fight. Jim knew this wasn't the Frank he had once
known, the man who had been strong, determined, and capable of doing whatever it took to survive.
That man had been replaced by someone desperate, someone willing to sacrifice anything to keep his family safe, even if it meant falling deeper into the pit of corruption. The gunman gestured for them to move. "You'll drive. It's a long way to the docks. Don't think about running. We'll be keeping an eye on you." Jim's mind raced as they were ushered toward the car. Every step he took felt like it brought him further away from any chance of escape. He couldn't help but wonder how deep this conspiracy went. Who were these people, and what exactly were they planning to do with the device? Once they were in the car, Frank's hands gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his breath shallow. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. Jim watched as Frank's eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror, expecting someone to be following them at every turn. But Jim wasn't worried about the people following them. He was worried about what they would find when they reached the warehouse, and whether they would even make it there alive. As they drove through the empty streets, the cityscape fading into the distance, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that the gunmen were playing a game with them. He wasn't sure how, but he knew there had to be more to this than just a simple delivery. The black box, the mysterious shipment, the threats, it all pointed to something much larger, something that, if they weren't careful, could end up destroying them both. The drive felt endless, each mile a countdown to their fate. Frank's hands were still trembling, but his lips were tight with fear. Jim glanced over at him, his mind working furiously. If they were going to survive this, if they were going to make it out with their lives, they needed to outthink their captors. But how? "Frank," Jim said, his voice low. "We have to think. We can't just do what they say. We need to find a way out." Frank's eyes widened in panic. "What do you mean? They'll kill us. If we don't do this, we're dead. They've already shown us what they're capable of." Jim leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "We can't trust them. We have to find a way to turn the tables." Frank's gaze flicked nervously to the road ahead, his eyes filled with doubt. "How? They know everything about us. We're nothing but pawns." Jim didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing: they had to try. If they didn't fight back now, they would never get another chance. The car grew quieter as they neared their destination, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped below the horizon. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark and menacing against the twilight sky. Jim knew that whatever happened next would decide their fates, and he wasn't sure they could survive the consequences of the choices they were about to make. The warehouse loomed like a monstrous silhouette. In the distance, a dark, looming structure surrounded by high walls and chains. Jim could feel his heartbeat in his throat, each pulse amplifying the tension that had coiled in the pit of his stomach. Frank's grip on the steering wheel was so tight his knuckles were white, his eyes flickering between the rearview mirror and the road ahead, as though expecting an ambush at any moment. Jim didn't share his fear. Instead, he was consumed by something darker: anger. He had been dragged into this world by the very people who claimed to be his allies, manipulated by a loyalty that now felt like a trap. His mind kept racing through every decision, every step they had taken that had led them to this moment. If they didn't get out of this now, there would be no escape. The black box, the gunman, the threats. They were just pieces in a larger game, one where their lives were expendable. "We can't trust them," Jim murmured, his eyes never leaving. "The warehouse in the distance." "I know," Frank replied, his voice shaky. "But what else can we do? They've got our families. We have no choice." Jim shot him a sharp look. "We always have a choice, Frank. We just need to find it." But as the car slowed to a stop in front of the warehouse, Jim knew they had
already lost some of their options. The gunman had given them no room to maneuver.
the only way out, it seemed, was to play along, at least for now. A figure emerged from the shadows near the entrance of the warehouse. A tall man dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by a hood. He didn't approach the car immediately, but stood motionless, watching them as if assessing whether they would be worth the trouble. Jim and Frank exchanged a glance. Frank's face was pale, his jaw tight with anxiety. Jim could feel the same fear gnawing at him, but he couldn't let it show, not yet.
Not when they were so close. The figure finally moved, striding toward the car with purposeful steps. Jim's heart pounded in his chest, each footfall growing louder in his ears. The man reached the passenger side of the car and knocked on the
window, his movements sharp and deliberate. Frank rolled the window down slowly, his eyes darting nervously between the man and Jim. The man didn't speak at first. Instead, he studied them both with a cold, calculating gaze, as if weighing their worth in his mind. "Do you have it?" the man finally asked, his voice low and gravelly. Jim's fingers itched to reach for the gun hidden beneath his jacket, but he kept his hands steady. Frank swallowed hard and nodded. "We have it." The man's lips curled into a thin, humourless smile. "Good. I've been waiting." Without another word, he motioned for them to follow him. The atmosphere was thick with tension as they exited the car, the heavy scent of salt water and old concrete filling the air. The warehouse loomed ahead, a gaping mouth waiting to swallow them whole. Jim kept his eyes trained on the man as they followed him into the building, his mind racing. This was the moment, the point of no return. If they were going to get out of this, it had to be now. But how? Inside the warehouse, the air was cold, the floors gritty with dust and remnants of forgotten goods. The low hum of machinery echoed through the cavernous space, amplifying the isolation. Shadows stretched across the walls, and Jim couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, one set for them the moment they had accepted the gunman's demands. The man led them deeper into the warehouse, where a large metal door stood ominously ajar. Behind it, Jim could make out the faint glow of fluorescent lights. The man paused in front of the door, turning to face them. "You'll place the box
inside," the man instructed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Then leave. Do not look back. Do not speak to anyone." Jim's pulse quickened.
The last part of his plan was about to unfold, and he couldn't afford any mistakes. He didn't trust this man, he didn't trust anyone here, but he had to act. Time was running out, and every second spent hesitating brought them closer to the edge of a cliff they might not survive. Frank moved forward, but Jim grabbed his arm before he could open the door. "Wait!" he hissed. "What are you doing?" Frank whispered urgently, his voice cracking. "We need to do this. They'll kill us if we don't." "I know," Jim said, his voice low but firm. "But we need to make sure we have an exit strategy. We can't just walk into this blindly." Frank's eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else there too, a growing sense of resignation. He wanted out, but he didn't see any way out. Jim could see it in his face. Frank was on the verge of breaking, but Jim wasn't ready to give up just yet. He had to buy them time. They had to figure out who was behind this and why they were being manipulated. Before Jim could speak again, the man in the hood turned toward them, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features.
"Are you done? We don't have all night." Jim exchanged one last look with Frank, his expression hardening. There was no time left for second thoughts. He pulled the black box from the car and approached the door. As soon as they entered,
the air seemed to thicken, heavy with the smell of metal and rust. The lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Jim couldn't shake the feeling that the room wasn't just a storage space, it was a stage, and they were the players, their every move being watched. At the far end of the room, a tall figure stood in the shadows. The face was obscured, but Jim could make out the outline of a man who exuded power. This was the person pulling the strings, the one who had orchestrated their descent into this madness. The hooded man gestured toward the figure in the shadows. "Place the box there, now!" Frank walked forward, his steps hesitant but determined. He placed the black box carefully on the table in front of the mysterious figure. The figure remained silent, studying the box as though it were the key to some larger puzzle. Jim couldn't take it anymore. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Why are you doing this?" The figure in the shadows finally spoke, his voice smooth and cold. "That's the question, isn't it? Who am I? Who are you? The real question is not who we are, it's who you'll become." Before Jim could process the meaning of the words, the lights flickered again, and a loud bang echoed through the warehouse. Frank turned toward the noise, panic flashing across his face. And that was when it all began to unravel. The figure in the shadows stepped forward, revealing a face Jim knew all too well. It was Frank's father, the man who had been presumed dead for years. The room seemed to freeze in time. Jim's heart hammered in his chest as the figure in the shadows stepped forward, revealing the face of someone he had long believed to be dead. Frank's father, once a powerful figure in the underworld, a man whose name had been spoken in whispers, stood before them. His eyes were cold, calculating as though none of the years had passed, as though he hadn't been lost to the world. He was the puppet master, the architect of the nightmare they had been trapped in. Frank's voice trembled, barely a whisper. "Dad, how are you alive?" Frank's father interrupted, his voice low and detached, almost amused. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're here. Both of you. Exactly where I need you." The words hit Jim like a punch to the gut. The man he had spent years protecting, his best friend, had been playing a dangerous game. Frank had been too naive to see it, but Jim had learned the hard way. Loyalty, it seemed, wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon, and now it had been used against him. Jim's gaze flickered between Frank and his father. The betrayal was complete. Frank hadn't just been manipulated by the men in the shadows. His own blood had orchestrated everything. "How long?" Jim asked, his voice hoarse, a bitter edge creeping in. "How long have you been pulling the strings, Frank? How long have you known?" Frank didn't answer immediately. His eyes darted from his father to Jim, confusion and disbelief warring within him. "I didn't know, Jim, I swear. I thought you were just a pawn in your father's game," Jim interrupted, his words sharp. He couldn't keep the anger from spilling over, couldn't suppress the overwhelming sense of betrayal. Frank had been his brother in arms, the one man he had trusted, without question, and now that trust lay in ruins. "You should have known," Jim spat, stepping closer. "You should have seen it." Frank's father stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "Enough. You're both in too deep to back out now. You think you can walk away from this? You think you can just make the right decision and everything will be fine? Jim stood frozen, his body trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. This was the end game. There would be no escape. Not for him, not for Frank. The stakes had always been higher than they'd realized, and now the final pieces were falling
into place. "Frank, don't do this," Jim pleaded, his eyes locking with his friend's. "You don't have to be part of this. You can still turn back." But Frank's face was unreadable.
The confusion had turned to something darker, something Jim couldn't quite understand. His eyes flickered toward his father, then back to Jim, as if weighing the decision in his mind. "I have to," Frank whispered. "You don't get it."
"He's my father. He's the reason I'm here. Everything we've done, it's because of him. We're part of this world, Jim. You knew that from the start." Jim's fists clenched at his sides.
"No, you're not. You were better than this. We were better than this." But Frank's father wasn't listening anymore. He gestured to the men standing in the corners of the room, their guns drawn, their eyes fixed on the two of them. The threat was clear. "This is how it ends," Frank's father said, his voice thick with authority. "You had your chances, Jim. You had your choices, but now there's no going back." The sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, and before Jim could react, Frank's father motioned for his men to take action. The plan was set into motion. Jim dove for cover, but it was too late. The gunfire erupted, the deafening noise filling the space. Frank's father had already sealed their fates. Jim was shot in the shoulder as he ducked behind a stack of crates. The pain was sharp, unbearable, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He pushed through, instinctively reaching for the gun at his waist, his fingers slick with blood. Frank, his eyes wide with shock and regret, hesitated. For a split second, Jim thought he might make a choice. He might step away from the edge, make the right decision. But then Frank's eyes shifted and Jim saw it. The same coldness he had seen in his father's eyes, the same emptiness. Frank
raised his gun. "No!" Jim shouted, but it was too late. The shot rang out, and Jim felt his body jerk violently, the impact slamming him back into the cold concrete. He collapsed, gasping for breath, his vision blurring as his blood pooled.
Around him, his fingers twitched, and he tried to raise the gun, to fire one last shot, but it was impossible. He was losing consciousness. Through the haze, he saw Frank's face. The tears in his eyes were the only sign of regret, but they were not enough to redeem him. Jim could see that now. Frank had chosen his side. His loyalty to his father had overpowered everything else, even their friendship. As the darkness began to claim him, Jim thought of the one thing that had sustained him all these years, the belief that loyalty meant something, that it could be a shield, a bond that could never be broken. But now he knew the truth. Loyalty had been his weapon, but it had also been his trap. The last thing Jim saw was Frank standing over him, his gun still in his hand, the weight of his actions finally settling in. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and with that, Jim's world went black. Months later, the warehouse stood silent, abandoned, its secrets buried in the dust and shadows. Frank's father had vanished into the underworld, leaving no trace of his existence. Frank, however, was never seen again. Some said he'd disappeared, into the shadows consumed by the weight of his choices. Others whispered that he had ended his own life, unable to live with the blood on his hands. As for Jim, his story became a cautionary tale, a warning to those who believed that loyalty could be a path to redemption. Loyalty, it seemed, was a double-edged sword. It could lift you to greatness, or it could tear you apart from the inside. The world moved on, indifferent to the lives lost in the pursuit of power and revenge. But Jim's name lingered in the minds of those who remembered, a man betrayed by his best friend, a man who believed in loyalty until it destroyed him. And as the years passed, his story became the stuff of legends, the tragic tale of a man who gave everything for loyalty, only to have it destroy everything he loved.